I know. I know. Just hear me out before clicking off or leaving me a hate comment or whatever. Firstly, I'm not pretending to hate this show because it's popular so I can stir up drama and get views. That's not something I would do. If you look at most of the rest of my channel, you'll find me being enthusiastic about video games that are already well liked and giving positive reviews to books by authors that are already well respected. In fact, because this video is off topic for my channel, I'll probably get fewer views than usual. Secondly, although I am going to express my own opinions, I have reasons for the things I'm saying beyond simply, I don't like it. When I tell you parts of this show are poorly written, I don't expect you to take me at my word. No, I'm going to reference specific events that take place on screen, and then explain why they don't work well with other events or how they undermine the story the show is trying to tell. Basically, I'm going to use my knowledge of how storytelling is supposed to work to explain why this show really doesn't at times, and I'm going to walk you through my exact thought process instead of, I don't know, telling you my unsubstantiated opinion and expecting you to instantly change your mind like I'm some sort of subhuman YouTube comment section entity. Thirdly, I'm not creating this video to insult the show's fans. I don't think you were stupid for liking the show as a child. I don't even think you're stupid for liking it now. I also like certain pieces of media, including children's media, that are deeply, deeply flawed, and I can say that because on an intellectual level, I'm capable of being critical of the things I'm emotionally attached to, and so are some of you. Lastly, believe it or not, I don't actually hate the show. I don't. I don't even think it's consistently terrible. It's more of a mixed bag. It gets some things right and a lot of things wrong. But the title of this video is not Avatar the Last Airbender is bad. The title of this video is Avatar the Last Airbender is overrated, and there's a difference. So no, it is not bad, but it's more popular than it has any right to be. It's achieved an exalted cultural status it doesn't deserve, and various big boy film writing website channels run by genuinely smart people keep saying shit like, nothing could possibly follow up this masterpiece, and it's the best show of all time, and so on and so forth, and that's just not true. So today I'm going to explain why, and reference some other shows that explored some of the same concepts or had some of the same plot beats, but ultimately handled them better. Now with all that out of the way, let's begin. To start off simple, what do we know about Aang's role in the story? Well, he's a young boy who suffers from a disease known as the Chosen One trope. He is the most special person alive, and it is his destiny to defeat the Fire Lord, and save the world, which he'll have no problem doing thanks to his natural talent and absolutely cracked Chosen One superpowers, which he conveniently gets back at exactly the right time without having to work for it, because they're with his rock, and the writer, Destiny, says so. If you can't already tell, I dislike this basic cut and paste plot template even when it's quote unquote done well or whatever, but this video isn't about that as a whole, and I really only wrote this section to introduce some information about him that will be relevant later, so let's move on to everything else. What do we know about Aang as a person? What do we know about his beliefs and where those beliefs come from? What do we know about the nature of his actions? What lessons does he need to learn in order to progress through his character arc? This is where things start to, I was gonna say get interesting, but it's more like fall apart in a slightly more interesting way. While not claiming to be a pacifist, Aang says that he's only used violence for necessary defense and that he's never taken a life. He seems to include animals in this, saying that all life is sacred, even that of the tiniest spider fly trapped in its own web. He also tells us that he got these beliefs from the monks, who are implied to be older, more experienced airbenders like Aang's late teacher, Monk Gyatso. Now, when Aang says this, it's framed as true, no one disputes it and the show doesn't bring it up too much, but the events of the plot and the setting itself conflicts with it. At the Southern Air Temple, the corpse of Monk Gyatso is surrounded by the corpses of a large group of Fire Nation soldiers, suggesting that he and the other monks killed them in self-defense. To be clear, in and of itself, that wasn't morally wrong of him to do, but it heavily implies that either 1, he doesn't actually think that it was morally wrong of him to do, or 2, when it comes down to it, he doesn't practice what he preaches. This could be an interesting thing to explore, but the show isn't interested in exploring it or explaining what sort of exceptions his beliefs might have. Instead, Aang gets sad and his Chosen One superpowers activate and we move on. The other thing is that what Aang believes about himself with regards to morality isn't true either. For instance, there's an episode where a buzzard wasp kidnaps Momo and he has to use his airbending to get him back. And he does, but then, after getting Momo back with the buzzard wasp flying away from them, he uses airbending to knock it out of the sky. So either he doesn't apply his rule of violence for necessary defense only to situations involving animals, which again he says he does, or he doesn't believe it at all. Or there's a gap between his moral code, his perception of himself, and the kind of person he really is. Earlier, there's another situation where the Fire Nation soldiers attack an Air Nation temple, which is very high up, and Aang creates a huge avalanche in order to stop them. I have a hard time believing that every single person in that avalanche survived, especially given that Shin the Conqueror died from much less. Again, this could be an interesting thing to explore, but in this case, the show not only doesn't explore it, but actively pretends it didn't happen. Like when Aang speaks to Yang Shen, he's still somehow coming from a place of having followed his moral code up to this point. And I know it's a cartoon, so they're probably operating on the children's cartoon logic of, well, they didn't die because they died off screen, but again, so did Shin the Conqueror. We never see his dead body. Plus, since the show covers serious issues like war and genocide, or at least pretends to and gets praised for it, it should hold itself to that sort of serious big boy standard when it comes to characters being killed, even if they're just background characters. Like, you can't have your cake and eat it too. Sometimes, this kind of thing can make for fascinating, even heart-wrenching stories. For instance, in another show, Madoka Magica, Sayaka starts out believing herself to be good and selfless and to have become a magical girl to help someone else without expecting anything in return. But without going into too much detail, she eventually discovered that the person she helped doesn't like her, as well as some unfortunate truths about what being a magical girl in her magical girl trope deconstruction universe actually entails. She then ends up in a bit of a downward spiral and ultimately realizes that her original intentions, at least subconsciously, were never purely selfless after all. But Sayaka isn't just a beautifully flawed character. The story around her acknowledges her flaws and her reasons for being the way she is, and gives her consequences for them. So the issue with the writing surrounding Aang isn't that there's a gap between his beliefs about morality and the way he actually behaves, or even that there's a gap between his perception of himself and the way he actually is. It's that the story itself engages in this sort of protagonist-centered morality and frames him as correct instead of giving him consequences for his actions and faulty reasoning, like what Sayaka gets. Now, in a vacuum, this wouldn't matter. Like, if this wasn't literally what the show came down to, I'd just ignore it. But it kind of is. Towards the end of the last season, Aang is facing a moral dilemma, really an incredibly contrived excuse for a moral dilemma with an obvious answer that he just doesn't want to hear, whether or not to kill the Fire Lord. And his morality, or rather the inconsistent writing, absolutely knocks the wind out of all the excuses the show's fans make for it. Like, it isn't true that killing the Fire Lord would be a betrayal of his cultural identity or whatever, when respected authorities within the Air Nation have killed dozens of low-ranking soldiers. And it isn't true that killing the Fire Lord would violate his own sense of morality either. Or if it is, he's already acted against that sense of morality to hurt people who are nowhere near as bad for much less meaningful reasons. In his video about energy bending, Hello Future Me claims that Aang not killing the Fire Lord is about sticking to his principles. I agree that this is what the writers were going for, but even aside from the aforementioned inconsistency, I still have issues with it. 1. Sticking to your principles isn't always good, and 2, it isn't the lesson Aang's being set up to learn. For instance, in real life, some Christian parents tell their children about hell and sometimes even repeatedly say, you need to do and or think, insert unhealthy thing here or you're going to hell, because they believe it's the right thing to do, not in order to be emotionally abusive sacks of shit. But they are emotionally abusive sacks of shit, obviously. The behavior and the effect is the same regardless of the intentions. That was an extreme example, but many of you watching this may have had a moment where you realize that, hey, this thing my parents or teachers told me isn't true, authority figures don't know everything, I need to think for myself and change my mind by integrating new information from the outside world into my belief system, etc., etc. I know I have, and might again at some point, but had you stuck to your principles in that situation instead of adapting and learning and growing, you'd still be ignorant. But the idea that we shouldn't kill people is morally good, and therefore not something that Aang needs to change his mind about because murder is wrong, right? Well, it's more complicated than that. If someone is actively trying to kill you, it isn't morally wrong to kill them in self-defense. If someone is going to kill a dozen other people and you're standing on the sidelines and you can stop it, but only by killing the would-be murderer, it isn't morally wrong of you to do so. In fact, depending on the way you see it, doing nothing because killing people is morally wrong or whatever might be morally wrong in and of itself. So, yes, that is the kind of black and white moralistic thinking that should be dropped in favor of a more nuanced, hands-on approach. What's more, Aang's character arc is initially set up in such a way that you think he's going to have to change his mind about this. He has to change, albeit superficially, the way he thinks about firebending and earthbending so he can, do them, and he has to change the way he thinks about being the Chosen One when Roku tells him the generic plot template stuff about how he has to defeat the Dark Lord before insert bad thing here. Like you, he had to integrate new information from the outside world, from other cultures even, into his belief system, and sometimes that involved changing what he previously believed. That's what his character arc was about, not becoming unbendable. If it was just about becoming unbendable, then the superficial lesson he learned about earthbending would have been it, but it wasn't. Instead, that just became a part of himself that he could tap into, and there were other lessons after it which functioned in a similar way. Now, there are still problems even with this initial setup. It's a bit shallow in terms of meaningful conflict, and I don't get the sense that Aang actually struggles with anything that much, so some of the lessons that were supposed to involve him struggling lose their impact. Which, I know that's a controversial statement, so I'll get back to it in a moment. But my point is that how the show ended for him undermines a lot of stuff from the earlier seasons. You might think that the point of Aang defeating the Fire Lord via energy bending rather than straight up killing him was to show that he's able to find a way out of his situation, or that the writers just cleverly subverted my expectations and I don't get it. And again, that was probably their intention, but neither of these things hold up from a storytelling perspective when you look at how they're actually supposed to work, and I'm going to explain why. When a character takes a third way out or solves an uncomfortable moral dilemma without getting their hands dirty, what's supposed to happen is that they work for it. Because the point isn't to spare them from the discomfort of having to make a difficult choice. It's that their own outside-the-box thinking or determination or character development or whatever have opened up a new path forward in a way that another character couldn't have, or in a way that they themselves couldn't have done earlier. But that's not how it is with Aang. With Aang, he just so happens to run into a convenient outside entity that gives him convenient extra superpowers in addition to the Chosen One superpowers he already has. Apparently, he has the ability to use his convenient extra superpowers because he is pure or unbendable or whatever, but how do we, the audience, initially know this? We know this because the convenient outside entity tells us, and that's it. He doesn't truly come off as unbendable in terms of his actual actions and personality. In writing, there's a saying, show, don't tell. Now, I don't think this applies to literally everything, and I do think some people overemphasize it. We generally don't need to know what colors your character's shirt is, or exactly how his legs are when he sits in a chair, or what the chair is made out of, or how tall it is. But, for moments that are supposed to be emotional, or that are supposed to relate to important plot points, or the culmination of a character arc, or both, show, don't tell probably applies. In this case, though, the problem runs much deeper than telling when you should be showing. No, the problem is that we are being told something while being shown something that contradicts it. We are being told that Aang has this pure, unbendable energy, while being shown someone who, for better or worse, doesn't always do what he believes to be right, whether the show acknowledges it or not, and is sometimes willing to change his mind out of necessity, if nothing else. Okay, but what about the idea that his energy is unbendable, as in he has a special sort of willpower or determination that no one else does? Well, that isn't backed up by the show either. It appears to be, but it's really not. And again, this is going to be one of the most controversial things I say in the entire video, but Aang doesn't struggle in a meaningful way. At least not in a way that makes me think of him as particularly determined for not giving up. This might not be obvious to most of you, and some of you are probably disagreeing with me already, but let me explain. On paper, Aang seems like a real trooper. He has to live with the genocide of his people, he has to master a bunch of unfamiliar skills in a short span of time, and he has to do a series of very dangerous tasks. But how much is he actually affected by these things? Like, how much do we feel like he's struggling against insurmountable odds over the course of the show? Of course, a character doesn't have to be a failure or a social outcast or lacking in natural talent or otherwise at a disadvantage to be compelling. That's just my personal preference most of the time. But if you want to say my protagonist is determined, he never gives up, and he has an unbendable will, then you do need to have at least some of that. A determined character's determination is only impressive if they're meaningfully challenged, if they spend most of their screen time struggling to overcome something much greater than themselves, and when they finally do manage to perform a difficult feat, it shouldn't be because they're naturally talented or they're the chosen one or an outside entity intervenes on their behalf. It should be because of who they've become over the course of their story and their willingness to persist in the face of huge setbacks. Again, Aang has none of this. He's already mastered airbending at the age of 13, and he masters waterbending as quickly as Katara does, not because he's more dedicated to it, or because he takes a different approach to it, or because of some outside-the-box thinking about the mechanics of it, or any real personality-related reason like that. It's because he's naturally talented. Later, we're told that he struggles with earthbending, and the show sort of half-heartedly conveys the idea of him struggling, but he gets that within a single episode and it's never a point of contention again. His unwillingness to firebend is just that, unwillingness, and that gets resolved over the course of a single episode too, and he's instantly good, or at least decent at it by the time the episode ends. I already told you about what I think of energy bending, so I won't repeat myself here. Plus, very few people question his Chosen One status or suggest an alternative method of defeating the Fire Lord that doesn't involve him and his special Chosen One superpowers. He never has to prove himself worthy of being the Chosen One, since in this world you're either born with it or you're not, and well, he is. We don't get the sense that other kids his age are doing significantly better than he is in terms of their bending abilities, or that there's some sort of unique obstacle in his path that puts him at a disadvantage compared to other people throughout the show. We don't get the sense that destiny is against him. To show you what I mean, let's take a look at another show, The Owl House. In The Owl House, the protagonist Luz is nobody and nothing. She is not the Chosen One, or the first person to come to the magical dimension, the demon realm, or the most powerful magic user, or anything like that. She's just a regular-ass mortal girl. But because she's just a regular-ass mortal girl, the writers have to make her interesting in other ways. She's neurodivergent, she's a huge fantasy nerd, and she's someone who has a hard time making friends, who doesn't quite fit in because of her personality. Like, she doesn't always have a sense of what's appropriate and what isn't. But it goes beyond that. While the story never feels like it's making fun of her for liking fantasy novels or being neurodivergent, it does point out when she has certain wrong-headed ideas about the real world because of the way she consumes her favorite works of fiction and absorbs their ideas. She does a lot of destructive activities in real life, and even though there are probably some people who hate her just because she's quote-unquote weird, as well as some ableist school officials she has to deal with, she also has legitimate flaws, and there are legitimate reasons why people may not like her. So, unlike Aang, she gets both significant consequences for being wrong and plenty of opportunities to learn from her mistakes, to learn how reality actually works, to learn that she isn't her self-insert Mary Sue Chosen One character, but that if she puts in the effort, she can make a significant impact in her own unique way. Plus, she doesn't have some innate, unearned magical ability that no one else has. Quite the opposite, in fact. The denizens of the Boiling Isles, the main place in the demon realm, were all born with the ability to use magic naturally, whereas she, being human, simply wasn't. In order to use magic, she must work even harder than they do and resort to experimenting with forbidden knowledge from the natural world. There are many episodes dedicated to her doing just this, and her process is really interesting. It very much mirrors the experiences I've had with creative failure, and this lack of natural magical ability also parallels the struggles of people with ADHD in real life, making it even more resonant. So, when she is able to crack the final boss villain's mask to catch him off guard, it feels earned. She doesn't do it because someone tells her that she has to, or because she's the chosen one and it's her destiny to save the world. They don't, and she isn't. Or because some outside entity gives her superpowers that she needs to save the day, or because she's born strong, or because she's more capable than the final boss villain. Again, they don't, and she isn't. Rather, it's a culmination of everything she's learned, and it shows. She is pinned to the floor by this nigh-immortal man who has a bunch of unique abilities that she cannot even fathom, that go light years beyond even those of regular magic users who, again, have far more natural ability than she ever will. She isn't supposed to be here. She isn't even supposed to matter at all, so he doesn't take her seriously as a threat. Because while she is the protagonist, as in she's the character whose journey we follow, she isn't treated as though she's more important than everyone else by the world around her. But after she's pinned down, after it's made clear to both her and the audience just how far out of her depth she is, with her one free hand, she uses a spell. a spell that she learned outside of the hexide school system, a spell that she taught herself by observing nature, a spell that we've seen her use before. In context, this act shows her courage, her determination, and her willingness to think outside the box, to break the rules, and it's a culmination of everything she's learned, the hard way with no natural talent and no natural superpowers. So even though she doesn't manage to fully defeat him in this scene, it means more to me than any of Aang's flashy Deus Ex Machina Chosen One bullshit ever will. When it comes to the idea of having the protagonist struggle and still not give up, the Owl House portrays that much better than Avatar the Last Airbender, because unlike Avatar the Last Airbender, the Owl House isn't afraid to acknowledge its protagonist is wrong and shake things up in terms of what kind of person gets to be a protagonist in the first place. But what about the genocide of Aang's people? Surely that must create difficulty or grief that he has to overcome, right? Well, not really. It's not what his character arc is about, and it's mostly just there for extra tragic backstory points, and to make him even more superficially special than he already is, being a last-of-his-kind fantasy character and all that. That might sound callous, but I'm only describing the way that the writing is. Aang's grief is more of a plot device than anything else. It gets brought up as part of a handful of episodes, and then that conflict is resolved by the end of each of those episodes, and that's that. It doesn't fundamentally change who he is. He doesn't lose his place in the world since, Chosen One, and he isn't a sick, starving refugee or a torture victim or anything like that. To be clear, this wouldn't be bad writing in a vacuum, but it does make me think of him as more similar to, well, a last-of-his-kind fantasy character rather than an actual real-life genocide survivor. To show you what I mean, let's take a look at Alton from the Poppy War. He's a terrible person through and through, and I'll get back to that in a second, but because the writing behind his character is better, he's somehow much more sympathetic than Aang. When Alton's people, the Spearleys, are attacked, he really does lose everything. In addition to losing his culture, he becomes homeless. He loses everyone who could have protected him, and then, as a literal child, he is sent to a laboratory and subjected to cruel human experiments. He was not treated like he was special. He did not have the same connections and status that Aang did. He did not go on fun adventures around the world. His time in the lab warped his personality. He became angry and bitter, and not in an I'm sad so I'm gonna activate my chosen one's superpowers and then we'll move on sort of way. No, it stays with him. He has that anger as a core part of his character motivation. There's an undercurrent of anger in almost everything he does, and it's portrayed really well. When the Nakara people find him, again as a literal child, they decide to exploit him by training him to be a child soldier. They use his anger to manipulate him, to motivate him to become the perfect child soldier, and this warps his personality even further. He doesn't care about being a good person anymore, and he doesn't care about his own well-being either. There's no rebuilding what he lost, and due to his environment and the discrimination against him, there's no making deep connections with new people either. There's only anger. But he cannot afford to fall into despair because the Nakara are only keeping him around since he's such a great soldier. So with nothing left, he leans hard into that anger until everything else he could have been takes a back seat. Then he is placed in a position of power and he cracks under pressure, doing horrible things not just to his enemies, but to his subordinates. We get brief flashes of other parts of himself, his kinship with the protagonist before he starts severely abusing her, his way of thinking about fighting, his potential relationship with this one other character, etc. It's just enough to see this glimmer of humanity inside of him before he became the person he is today. Like, he had the potential to be a good person, and I'd argue that he even had the opportunity to be a good person, but over and over and over again, he just sort of doesn't, albeit for somewhat sympathetic reasons. It isn't just that he suffered more on paper, it's that his actual motivations and character flaws are, 1, connected to that suffering, but more importantly, 2, acknowledged by the story itself. Again, Alton is he's not just a terrible person, he's literally the worst person alive. He's an abuser, he tortures people on screen, he made an actual child who he could have spared die a slow and painful death out of a misdirected sense of wanting revenge for something that said child had nothing to do with. He does all of this without remorse and only gets worse and worse as the story progresses, but the author doesn't pretend that he's a good boy or excuse his actions or give him free outside help because oh, he suffered, or oh, he's special. And because of that, and because of the way his emotions are portrayed, he feels like a real person who actually went through all that and not just a generic last-of-his-kind fantasy character like Aang. Of course, I'm not excusing Alton's actions. I would much rather have seen the protagonist get redeemed than him, and I know that she doesn't have to forgive him. He crossed the line multiple times, so even if he stopped his shitty behavior forever and became quote-unquote redeemed in that sense, he could spend the rest of his life making up for the atrocities he's committed, and he should, but honestly, it still wouldn't be enough. Some things just can't be made up for. Some things just can't be undone. But he's dead, and he never showed any substantial interest in changing his behavior, so it's a moot point. But the bottom line is, these are fictional characters. Alton is not a real abuser in the same sense that Aang is not a real preteen boy. And since the former is well written and the latter isn't, I feel for the former even as I am rooting against him, but not for the latter even as the writers want me to be rooting for him. It's bad enough to tell the audience something and then show them something that contradicts it, but that isn't the end of it. On the rare occasions that Aang does fail to do something, he doesn't get any real consequences for it, nor do the ordinary people step in to save the day. Rather, because he's the chosen one and it's his destiny to save the world, the show's writing will warp around him. The universe will solve his problems for him instead of him having to do it himself, but then he gets credit anyway. Again, he fails to either accept that he has to kill the Fire Lord or actively come up with some way around him. The universe just Deus Ex Machina Chosen One Destiny bullshits him a solution. And I might look like I'm ripping on this one example too much, but the rest of this story has a lot of this type of thing as well, and this is just the example I feel the need to go the most in depth with since people keep writing bad faith defenses of it. Like, I've heard people say that there was some precedent for Aang getting energy bending because of what Iroh says when he's teaching Zuko lightning redirection. But even with that scene in mind, it isn't established to work in the way that Aang ends up using it. Furthermore, Zuko has to actually apply effort and grow as a person and have one of the top 10 child abuse victim redemption arcs of all time in order to get lightning redirection. He doesn't simply have the ability gifted to him because the universe decided he was special. And in terms of the rest of the story, instead of, mastering the Avatar state, Aang happens to land in a convenient position with a rock in the center of his back, which allows him to use the Avatar state long enough to defeat the Fire Lord without having to actually do anything. Instead of having to struggle through learning waterbending, he's just naturally good at it. Instead of having to think of a clever solution to save the Northern Water Tribe by mortal means, he combines with a fish spirit and turns into Godzilla before he even masters waterbending. And this isn't something he can do because he spent his entire life learning about the spirits and thus knows all their secrets. It's something that he, and only he, can do rather than anyone else because he's the chosen one and it's his destiny to save the world. I'm not going to list every single instance of this, but once you start to see past the mysticism surrounding the Avatar and the idea of destiny in the fantasy genre more generally, and look at those things for what they really are, you'll be able to find more on your own. And you'll find that a character having a destiny is not always profound or grand or special. It's sometimes a fake deep plot device for making that character do what the writers want, regardless of whether or not they've earned it, at best, and as an excuse to be elitist and deterministic, at worst. But wait! There's more! Aang's shitty character writing, 1, occasionally extends past him and starts infecting otherwise decently written characters that he interacts with, and 2, pretends that it's subversive and interesting, that it cleverly subverts your expectations, even though, again, it's just the same recycled Chosen One bullshit that we've been consuming this whole time, just with worse writing and an unhealthy dose of protagonist-centered morality. And to get into all that, I'm going to have to talk about 1, Aang's terrible romantic subplot with Katara, and 2, the show's poor handling of his failure to unblock all his chakras or whatever, since apparently those things are connected. So, most people acknowledge that the romantic subplot was just bad. Even the people who like the show. It's shallow, it's will they or won't they, and even if you want to argue that Katara clearly liked Aang back, there's very little meaningful change or development in their dynamic. She is doing most of the emotional labor in the relationship, comforting him, healing him, etc., and he doesn't respect her boundaries. Also, he idealizes her and denies her actions in her worst moments. But this isn't portrayed as him doing something wrong or as an unhealthy relationship. It's portrayed as the kiss at the end of the show, the happily ever after, without Aang having to actually change his shitty behavior towards her or adjust his perception of her to be more accurate. Like, Katara's own shitty behavior towards Toph and Sokka isn't an accident or an outlier or out of character or somehow okay. It's, well, shitty. But it shows an important part of her personality that comes from what is ultimately a sympathetic place. Towards the end of the show, there's a rift between Aang and Katara because of all this, but again, it gets repaired without Aang having to actually do anything. And I'll come back to that in a moment, but I'm just now realizing that the script isn't very well organized. Fucking hell. Anyways, in order to master the Avatar state, in theory, Aang needs to let go of his attachments, specifically his idealized attachment to Katara, and grow as a person. And he simply doesn't do this. He continues to idealize her while also being over-reliant on her and not really giving anything back. And again, it's not because of a clever workaround on his part. It's because of the aforementioned rock to the back situation. Of course, the fans who like that are going to say, oh, it cleverly subverted my expectations and I'm just too stupid to understand it. But what I think more people, writers and members of the audience alike, need to understand is that there's a difference between subverting your audience's expectations in a way that actually makes sense and adds to the story thematically, and subverting them in a way that's just bad writing. Like, if everyone got the plague and died, what's another generic Chosen One franchise? Harry Potter. If in the 6th book, everyone got the plague and died instead of the final battle where the Chosen One defeats the Dark Lord, that would subvert our expectations, but not in an interesting way. There would be no foreshadowing, and it would add nothing to Harry Potter as a character. Now, I'm not saying that Harry Potter is as good as its fans think it is either, or that it handles its themes all that well, but it doesn't reward Harry Potter for failing to grow and then let him defeat Voldemort via last-minute extra superpowers with no explanation and a rock to the back anyways. No, the only thing Harry Potter has that comes off as natural Chosen One talent is his affinity for defense against the dark arts and his ability to talk to snakes. And he doesn't use an exceptionally galaxy-brained defense against the dark arts scheme to defeat Voldemort. No, he literally defeats Voldemort by using Expelliarmus, the spell that makes the wand fly out of the other person's hand. A thing that even beginners can do. A thing that we see Harry Potter himself do multiple times before, right as Voldemort is casting Avada Kedavra, the one-hit kill spell. So Voldemort is killed by his own wand in a precedented and perfectly believable way that also sounds like something Harry Potter would do. But the most frustrating thing about the attempt at subversive writing in Avatar the Last Airbender is that the idea of a Chosen One actually refusing to let go of their personal attachments as part of their character growth can be done well. It can be meaningful and emotionally compelling. It's just that in this particular case, it really isn't. There's a less well-known, less critically acclaimed cartoon called She-Ra and the Princesses of Power that manages to do it in a way that makes sense from a character perspective, and I'm going to explain how exactly it is and what makes She-Ra's journey different from Aang's. So, She-Ra and the Princesses of Power has Adora, who defects from the bad guy's army and ends up running away from her abusive mother after figuring out that they're bad. This is a massive oversimplification of a really interesting situation, but bear with me. Also, she's the Chosen One, and it's her destiny to balance the planet, save the world, or whatever. This is also a massive oversimplification of a really interesting situation, but again, bear with me. As the Chosen One, Adora is told that she needs to let go of her attachments so that she can be the Chosen One and use her Chosen One superpowers and use her job. But she rebels because, well, those attachments are really important to her. On the surface of it, this looks a lot like Aang's situation, but it works better in her case for at least 2 reasons that I can think of. Firstly, it fits with what her character arc is about. So again, Adora is a child abuse victim. To be specific, she was abused in a way that isolated her from others by elevating her above them, disconnected her mind from her own true desires, made her self-sacrificing in an unhealthy way, and made her think that things outside her control were her fault. Her character arc, then, is about unlearning all that, about connecting with others as equal instead of just people who need to be protected with no agency of their own, about embracing her true desires for love, not sacrificing herself just because she's quote-unquote supposed to, recognizing and accepting when something is outside of her control, and being reassured that her friends still like her even if she can't always save the day. She is able to do her character arc because of a neat little thing called the power of friendship, since she's a sparkly, shiny princess in a children's cartoon about the power of friendship. No, really. Running away and forming relatively healthy relationships gives her an outside point of reference and helps her partially recover. When she goes, "Oh no, this is all my fault," her friends comfort her instead of reinforcing it, and they are the ones who initially showed her the truth about the bad guy army and the outside world to begin with. Her journey closely mirrors the journeys of many people who get outside help to deconvert from Christianity in real life, and although she's legitimately unpleasant at times, that just makes her feel more real, and her story ultimately has a valuable message. So when she is told to let go of her relationships, her new, healthy relationships where she gives just as much as she takes, we don't want her to do that since that would make her not recover or do the character arc thing or whatever. Instead, we're happy for her when she rebels and says that her attachments make her strong, that they're a part of who she is, that she became She-Ra to help people, not just to do the Chosen One destiny thing. And this is interesting because in She-Ra, your supposed destiny isn't necessarily good, but it isn't inevitable either. Rather, destiny is basically just a thing that various shitty authority figures attempt to inflict upon you, and if you have enough power of friendship or whatever, you can resist and forge your own path instead. So here, destiny is not, well, a fake deep plot device for making a character do what the writer wants. Rather, destiny, or the idea of destiny, is used to generate meaningful internal and external conflict and to triumphantly highlight or tragically remove characters' agencies, with some characters successfully breaking free of their destinies and that being a satisfying conclusion. And secondly, when Adora finally does unlock her Chosen One's superpowers to the fullest extent, it ties into the ideas explored in her character arc rather than being because she got hit in the back with a rock real hard. She consciously acknowledges that she has desires outside of being a hollow vessel that sacrifices itself to save the world. More specifically, she consciously acknowledges her romantic feelings for Catra and that she cares about her friends. And because of the way that magic is established, has already been established to work in the show thematically, representing love and freedom and achieving your full potential, this acknowledgement allows her to fully become She-Ra and achieve her true form. Not only does it, actually make sense, it's genuinely inspiring. She has to do character arc stuff for it to work, and it isn't solely an external thing gifted to/inflicted upon her by the writers. The wider show itself has other problems. Shallow world building, poor pacing, a final season that doesn't quite stick the landing in terms of some of its characters' arcs, including Adora's if I'm being perfectly honest, but it managed to pull off this specific idea far, far better than Avatar the Last Airbender, and it deserves credit for that. Aang didn't have to go through all that. To be clear, I don't think a character has to be a child abuse victim or even be tragic in a general sense in order to be interesting. But with Adora, that tragedy is set up for this, is something she must overcome, and her rebellion is both tied to the ideas explored in her character arc and something she must actively face consequences for. Some things certainly are easier for her because she has a destiny, because she's initially accepted into the Princess Alliance for being She-Ra, because she was born special compared to someone like Catra, and that natural specialness makes her somewhat unrelatable to someone like me. But this is acknowledged in story to create meaningful conflict, and the solutions to most problems aren't literally handed to her or found by sheer luck. Instead, she must accept help from her friends, devise some sort of workaround, or progress in her character arc for them to become available. Aang, you already know how I feel about him. He's a power fantasy for nice guys. He's a generic plot template chosen one through which the generic plot template story is conducted. He is the protagonist of a show with protagonist-centered morality, so he never has to be called out on his behavior in a way that matters, and he never has to meaningfully grow. He's a nothing character written by people who think that new superpowers are character development, and that solving your character's problems for them by having them roll a 20 is the same thing as them working for it. He's a shitty writing construction. I can't even hate him as a person in the way that I can hate Alton as a person, because Alton is at least written as a coherent person, and Aang isn't. I might sound like I'm annoyed at Aang sometimes, but I'm not really annoyed at him. I'm annoyed at the writers for creating him, in the same way that people at gEnOcIdE would probably be annoyed at Season 1 Luz if they were forced to listen to her talk about herself insert Mary Sue Chosen One character for 10 hours. Or actually, it goes beyond that, because Luz herself is a fictional character, and again, she's a neurodivergent teenager who is framed as wrong and naive by the story itself, and she has to actually learn her goddamn lesson. Whereas the people who created Aang are real-ass grown men who constantly get praised for their quote-unquote good writing. Neither they nor their character ever had to learn the lessons she did, so all we're left with is this hollow series of events that has no meaningful conflict or struggle or suffering, that's just plain boring once you strip the mysticism and superficial specialness away. But I think there's something we can salvage here. A lesson or two that we can learn about framing, character writing, character agency, media literacy, and the sort of setup required to make a trope subversion work, or something. So, the first thing is that I think people need to consume more good media as well as a wider variety of good media so they can really see what's out there. And that includes reading actual books. Now, in a moment, I'm going to talk about how media literacy helps you recognize bad writing, but the bottom line is, in order to recognize when a trope is being executed poorly, it helps to see it executed well at least a handful of times so you can have an outside reference, so that you can know what it's supposed to look like and how all those fancy terms from your media literacy class were supposed to be applied. Shine a light and all the objects before it cast a harsher shadow. If you want to watch a show with a character who isn't as noble as they think they are, watch Madoka Magica. If you want to watch a show where the chosen one disobeys and it's actually warranted and well written, watch She-Ra. If you want to watch a show where the protagonist isn't the chosen one at all, but a mortal girl with no magical abilities and a unique set of other disadvantages, who must struggle and adapt and work as hard as everyone else, if not harder, just to keep pace with them, watch The Owl House. If you want to take this a step further and play a game where you struggle as an unchosen hero, and where that difficulty is tied to certain aspects of the story, play Hollow Knight. If you want to play a game where a character gets extra superpowers as a reward for character development, but that character development is first shown rather than told, play Deltarune. Some other good games include Gree, Rainworld, and One Shot, and a list of book and show recommendations will be pinned in the comments section below. Like, again, once you start consuming actual good media, you will be able to better see what I am talking about. So let's move on to the other stuff. Secondly, if you're looking at a fantasy series where characters have destinies or whatever, how is that being used thematically? Is destiny an actual physical force in the world, or is it simply something people believe in? And if it is an actual physical force in the world, how does that conflict with the whole idea of people having free will? How does it manage to avoid the moral simply being, only people who are born special can save the day or do anything meaningful in this deterministic universe because it will solve all their problems for them without them having to work for it? Oh, and if you're unattractive or not naturally talented, you're a background character and you don't matter. If the idea of destiny is used to create meaningful conflict and explore ideas like elitism or freedom or the fallibility of authority figures, that's great. But if the Chosen One simply does the Destiny thing with their Chosen One superpowers because they are the Chosen One and Destiny says so, or because of a Deus Ex Machina, that doesn't feel earned and it's not thematically interesting. Thirdly, framing is important. I've already discussed framing a little, and I think you guys are smart enough to get the gist of what I'm talking about, but I really want to go into it. Framing has to do not just with what events happen, but how characters react to them and the way they're portrayed in the story and what the moral of the story is. For instance, in Gone with the Wind, slavery isn't portrayed as being that harmful to black people, and we're mainly supposed to focus on and feel bad for the former planter class when their lives change for the worse after losing the Civil War. The trauma that the black supporting characters would realistically have from enslavement isn't explored, not even in a way that would just amplify or be a character foil to the main white girl. So, Gone with the Wind isn't racist for portraying slavery, it's racist because of the way that slavery is framed. Like, if a character makes statements about themselves and those statements are framed as true but turn out not to be, I'm not going to praise you for having a flawed character or for quote-unquote good writing. I'm going to be suspicious of you. But if a character makes a statement about themselves and it's false, and it's also framed as being false by the story itself, so they have to learn or they have to face consequences, that's where things get interesting. And lastly, if you want us to feel like a character worked for something, if you want to, again, frame them as having worked for it, or as having certain personality traits, you need to show us rather than simply telling us and giving them free superpowers. Avatar the Last Airbender is not a bad show. Toph, Sokka, and Zuko are all surprisingly well-written characters, especially when compared to Aang. Even Katara has her moments when she's not being railroaded into that shitty romantic subplot with all her trauma and how she was forced to grow up too fast. The world building is good, and once you get past season 1, the pacing is good too. But, for reasons I've already mentioned, it is also not a good show overall. My hope is that, with time, the praise and influence will begin to fade. That as people consume more media and better media, they'll start to see the cracks in the writing and the superficial specialness will start to wear thin. That eventually everyone will move on to something else, something that is ultimately more deserving of their attention. like this Megalovania meme I found on the internet.